Let's get started talking about trade in a general sense, and I think that's my understanding. The Chinese never actually said, "May you live in interesting times," but over the last 18 months, I think the Chinese would even agree that these have been interesting times, and not just the Chinese, but lots of others around the world. So to start, let's take stock. I'll start with Andrea. We're 2 years into an administration that has embraced confrontation and tariffs as a negotiating strategy for trade deals. How's that working, and how has it affected the global trading system and the global economy?
That's a huge question. Let me start with this. I think the biggest factor for anybody who's observing in the business community is what do you do with all this? How do you dial it into your long-range plans? How do you dial it into your numbers? How do you dial it into your decisions about purchasing, about where to invest? And if businesses, they know how to cope with what they know about and what they may not like, but what they don't like is uncertainty. And I think that's sort of the biggest concern that most people have. Wherever any of this ends up, they would like it to end up somewhere, and they'd like it to end up somewhere sooner, right? Because otherwise you're still dealing with a certain level of uncertainty. And I think you have to, when you look at the tariff situation, and they refer obliquely in the new reports. We have a couple of reports that were out in the last week. One is from the WTO, which was issued around the 2nd, maybe last week. And then, of course, the IMF meetings that are going on now, and IMF just issued its projections for global growth. And I think it's clear from those reports that it's quite difficult to put a number on this, right? Because you don't know how businesses are coping, and it depends on the business, it depends on the sector, and it depends on their perception of the permanence and longevity of these tariffs and not just the magnitude of them. So I think one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is that there are at least sort of 3 buckets of these kinds of tariffs, right? You've got the initial safeguards that the administration used at the very beginning on solar panels and washing machines. So to me, that sort of indicated a willingness to use tariffs pretty readily to deal with questions of unfair trade, but still very limited in scope, right, in terms of the number of products and in time frame. And then you have the Section 232, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about on steel and aluminum. And there too, those can be reversed pretty much when the administration decides to do that. The key question there is, and for the system as a whole, our trading partners don't think we had a legitimate reason to cite national security for imposing the tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. So there's kind of a whole systemic question, which I'll let other panelists address, about the proper use of Section 232 for those tariffs. And because of that questioning and the questioning the legitimate use, that caused them to sort of both take cases in the WTO but preemptively challenge by imposing retaliatory tariffs. It's those retaliatory tariffs on everything, including agriculture and other products, that I think threw a lot of uncertainty into economic growth here and globally, because it really touches so many of our key trading partners. And then you layer on top of that the tariffs with China under the Section 301, and now you're talking about enormous breadth in terms of the number of products the tariffs are on, so everything from food to the refrigerators we put the food in. But critically, over half of what we import is inputs into manufacturing. So you're talking about building materials, minerals, metals, the machine tools that go into manufacturing products. So when you dial all that in, there's a broader case to be made for the impact that it can have on growth of the economy overall, on productivity. Interestingly enough, so what these reports sort of cite is that volume in global trade may be slowing by some amount, maybe projected 2.6% in 2019 as opposed to 3%. And that may be having an impact, or may have some impact on global growth. But when you look at it against other factors, fiscal policy, monetary policy, even the emission standards in Germany, all of those other things, it's very hard for them to, with any precision, say what impact trade tensions may be having. And in fact, there's some really interesting tidbits. U.S. imports actually grew by 5%, 5%, which is, and that may be people, making purchasing decisions trying to get ahead of increase in tariffs on imports from China. So it's not clear, is what it comes down to, that it's having a significant impact. But the biggest impact is uncertainty. Companies are taking a wait-and-see approach and trying to decide how long will these tariffs be in place, and should I make different decisions in my supply chain,
Mike, the strategy itself, the administration's reached for 301, certainly reached on 232, according to a lot of critics, but they say tariffs are a good negotiating strategy because they force people to the table, they force compromise. Do you agree, and is there some evidence of that?
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that the use of unilateral tariffs has helped bring China to the negotiating table. Whether you think that's the right approach or the wrong approach, it's hard to argue with that. I think that the unanswered question is, will that same strategy help deliver an agreement with China that really delivers significant benefits for the long run, the kinds of structural reforms that we've heard about, increased protection of intellectual property, reduced use of industrial subsidies, getting away from forced technology requirements. And to me, I'm concerned that it won't because of your opening question, because the mechanism that is being contemplated is not one that will lead to a durable agreement that can be enforced over time. I mean, the U.S. has been pretty clear that what it wants to see is basically the right to judge China's compliance with the commitments in the agreement, and in the event of noncompliance, choose its own measures to retaliate. This is dramatically different from U.S. trade policy up until now, which has relied on third-party dispute settlement as a way to resolve disputes, use sanctions for the limited purpose of trying to achieve compliance, and avoid tit-for-tat tariff escalation. And so, because it appears the U.S. is not pursuing that approach of third-party dispute settlement, I'm worried that commitments in the agreement will look very strong in these areas, but will not achieve structural reform, will not be lasting, will not provide the certainty that business is looking for, again, because it lacks that sort of independent body to judge whether both sides are living by its terms.
I'll get into the details of the China negotiations in a moment, but Warren, before we do that, I want to ask you, you've been doing this a long time. Where do you think all this leaves the global trading system, the third-party dispute settlement system? Is it going to be in tatters at the end, and this become a model for the future? Or does, when a new president takes the oath of office, we go back to the old system?
I think on some parts of it, we may go back to the old system. I think the thing that's been a tectonic change has been China, where I think you see bipartisan and intellectual support for the tougher approach with China. I think Mike is right, and I think reflects most opinion in the trade community that tariffs have brought China to the table. The problem with the Trump policy is the randomness of the use of tariffs and the fact that we've also put tariffs on a lot of our key allies and trading partners like the EU, Japan, Canada. And to the extent that another part of the strategy ought to be mobilizing multilateral support about some of the concerns about some of these Chinese practices, and that multilateral support is out there, we've sort of undercut some of the tariff pressure that we've put on China. As far as the dispute settlement system, I think the Trump administration, particularly Lighthizer, who has longstanding and strong views about this, doesn't like the WTO dispute settlement system, probably doesn't have that much of a stake in finding a solution to it, and at the end of it, it will be in tatters.
Go ahead, Doug.
Just would offer one thought too, particularly when you talk about kind of the systemic aspect of this. And Andrea mentioned the question whether or not countries think we have a legitimate basis to declare national security emergency in aluminum. And this gets to the broader question, are by the standards, that the rest of the global economy, are these legitimate acts? And, if you think about the role that the U.S. has played historically in terms of providing leadership for liberalization, opening up of markets, it really was setting a set of norms for behavior. Well, we, the United States, are setting norms of behavior now, but not necessarily in that, and certainly not in that direction. And the way that we're doing that, tariffs based on national security exemptions, that is a pretty big door to walk through that a lot of other countries over time now have at their disposal, that historically everyone has shied away from worrying. So I think systemically, yes, there are certain elements that may change administration to administration, but there has been a systemic change in the approach, and other countries will take advantage of that, and that will be a challenge for certainly, for the United States, for example, in terms of its own export interests.
Well, let's talk specifically about some of the individual trade disputes that are underway right now. Trade disputes, negotiations, depends on which side you're on. Mike, what's your read on China, where we are now, and where we're going, where we might end up?
Yeah, I suspect that the U.S. and China will meet the notional goal that President Trump has talked about himself of reaching an agreement within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, something along those lines. I think it will be concluded by negotiators, blessed by leaders, and again, I think that there has been a lot of good work done in terms of some of these structural issues, bringing in rules from other agreements that would apply bilaterally between the United States and China that stand the chance of improving the protection of intellectual property, dealing with some of the advantages enjoyed by SOEs. The part that I'm more concerned about is the mandatory purchase requirement, which is apparently what President Trump is most focused on. That really kind of contradicts the other element of the negotiation, which is focused on market reform and limiting the role of government in trade and investment flows. Of course, mandatory purchases goes in the opposite direction and will be cause for concern among U.S. trading partners as well. Thirdly would be the timing of the rollback of tariffs. The U.S. position is they want to keep those in place for a period of time to verify Chinese compliance. China, of course, is looking for immediate relief, and they'll probably find some compromise that involves some, but not total rollback of the tariffs. And then finally, is what I mentioned before, enforcement. That is a two-way tool. So China, like the United States, it is expected, will have the ability to judge U.S. compliance with the rules that they're agreed to, and to bring sanctions if they find that the U.S. is in breach. This, I think, is a cause for concern, particularly when people look at, well, this is going to be the first agreement with China to have a currency provision. How might that be used? Or other obligations in the agreement. And so, again, the absence of third-party dispute settlement, I think, creates a significant risk that we could find ourselves relatively quickly back in a situation where both sides are accusing the other of breach and we're imposing tariffs.
Warren, the president seems very focused on the bilateral trade deficit. Bob Lighthizer and company seem very focused on changing China's trade and industrial practices. Which one gets what they want, or do both?
Well, Trump is the president, so he definitely gets what he wants. I think the president is definitely focused on the $1.2 trillion dollars in Chinese commitments to purchase U.S. goods. There's some questions whether that's actually realistic. In some sectors, we probably don't have the capacity to meet some of the numbers that have been thrown around. But, I think for the president, it's an attractive element. It's probably the one that he understands the best, just because, and it's also something that he can easily used to explain why this is a monumental trade agreement, the best trade agreement in the history of U.S.-China trade agreements, and something that he explained to his base. It also takes care of his immediate political problem because, you know, throwing tariffs out does have costs, and we're seeing those costs. But the big cost so far has been agriculture, which is a big part of the president's base, critical when he's running for re-election in 2020, and has just gotten hammered because, first of all, everyone knows that it's politically sensitive in any administration, and they also know that it's part of Trump's base. So all of, you know, the retaliatory tariffs for what we've done under 232 or 201 or 301, they've been heavily, overwhelmingly focused on agriculture.
Andrea, the administration kind of went at China unilaterally, but this is something that the rest of the world seems to agree on is a problem. What does the rest of the world want to see out of this besides the Trump administration and what their goals are we've just talked about?
Yeah, I think absolutely you're starting to see more discussion in the WTO, or at least on the margins, between among the European Union, Japan, the United States, Canada, and others, about what do you do about industrial subsidies? What do you do about forced technology transfer? What do you do about areas of intellectual property theft that are not well covered by existing WTO rules? And all of these things are threats to the global trading system. It is a different economic model. It doesn't comport with and is not governed by disciplines in the WTO. And this approach, the unilateral approach, is forcing the conversation. So whether it's tackled well or thoroughly or enforceably in the agreement that they come up with is only the beginning. It's the beginning of a larger conversation, and I think that is starting to take place. I also think that we can't expect to resolve all of those issues that I just mentioned. I mean, information harvesting, cybersecurity threats. When you look at the White House report on concerns about sort of economic vectors that China's approach in so many of these areas, regulatory coercion, all of these things, you're not going to see that the trade agreement itself is going to address all of that. And I don't think we should measure their success solely by what they come up with there. There is, I think, what's interesting to me is more of a whole of government approach that's being undertaken through cases that the Department of Justice is prosecuting, through strengthening of our CFIUS approach to looking at doing investment reviews of incoming investment. That has tightened to a very significant degree. So there are other things that are happening in sort of the ecosystem on these questions of China that the U.S. has sort of started, and sort of you can disagree with the tactics and the unilateral nature of it, but I don't think many countries sort of disagree with their concerns around it. And if it leads to a deeper discussion about how to increase or create new disciplines and rules that address this in the WTO, I think that's a good thing, and I think it is starting to happen.
Doug, this being, if anybody who knows anything about trade knows this is being negotiated very quickly. What's the shelf life of this going to be? If you're an American company, how far out are you going to be able to plan based on the deal that we get?
Well, probably not very far. But let me explain that statement. So, the thing to remember with, trade agreements is that typically they're usually a function of two parties who want to come to an agreement. And I appreciated the first survey question that you put forward, and the fact that the group was fairly optimistic. But it was sort of the rule of thumb when you're negotiating these things is you really need to kind of find the solution that's sort of the win-win, because essentially if you don't, your negotiating partner is going to find a way to, let's say, disabuse you of the achievement at some point. And so, that is a structural impediment to the approach that's being taken here. I fully agree that the only reason China came to the table was because they were being forced to by the tariffs. But you then have to understand that, so how durable is this thing if you're working with a partner who doesn't necessarily see this as in their economic interests? They have a development model that they've been working to. I think they think has been working pretty well. President Xi has been very clear. His larger set of ambitions and economic development and the economic contract that he has with his people is an important part of that. So China's incentive to kind of work with this is they certainly don't want to see tariffs put back on place. But one of the things that, for those of us who have been working with, through the SNED process, and China is very adept at using process and the regulatory backstory. I mean, I think everyone here in this audience from the financial services sector, for example, can appreciate that you can have reductions in equity caps, or increases in equity caps so you can invest more in China, but then it turns out the licensing provision is sort of important and what kind of products you can sell. And so the devil's in the details. You're never really going to be able to capture all of that detail in an agreement, even one that's 200 pages. And so you're really relying on the good faith of your partner. And I think that is going to be a challenge given kind of, this is to Andrea's point as well, the structural changes that we're seeking from China. So you're sort of starting with an inherent conflict and tension. I think a real question, in addition to the kind of the features that have been outlined by the other speakers, is what is the process that's going to be in place for resolving differences going forward? Because there are going to differences coming out of the agreement, and there's going to be all the things that we never really covered or new things that come up. And I think if we can take comfort from that there seems like this is a meaningful process, that it has real outcomes, this is not a one-off, these are longer-term issues, then you can probably take some comfort. But if it's not, then I think companies are going to have to be very, very clear-eyed about what's going to come out of this exercise.
We could talk China all day, but I want to shift gears, pun intended, to auto tariffs for a moment. It's the big threat hanging out there, and it seems to be a predicate for a lot of other trade issues at the moment. Yesterday, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley, who's supposed to be a Trump ally, said the 232 investigation into autos was not done in a very professional and intellectually honest way. That's his words, and that's why we haven't seen it. Mike, do you think that he might be right, and do you think we might actually see it and that the president might actually use it? Or is it just going to be this cudgel kept under wraps and we can keep waving it at people?
I don't know if we'll see it. I think Senator Grassley was just expressing publicly what everyone thinks. I mean, unlike the steel and aluminum 232, there's no support at all for imposing these kinds of tariffs on autos and auto parts. And that's bipartisan on the Hill and certainly all of the private sector. It also seems like the administration, the key advisors, are lined up against this and want to avoid releasing the report and certainly avoid imposing tariffs, which would be very destructive of what they're trying to accomplish in terms of getting USMCA through the Congress and finalizing the China agreement. So I think one way or another, so the president has to make a decision on this report by May 17th. One way or another, I think that they will essentially kick the can down the road. They won't close the investigation, which would require a finding of no national security threat, but they will enter into negotiations with major exporting countries, or they will sign a tariff proclamation but suspend its effect with respect to important exporting countries. But one way or another, I think that they will take action that tries to keep a lid on this while at the same time maintaining the threat, principally for leverage in potential trade negotiations with both the Japanese and the Europeans.
Well, the president has talked about this primarily in connection with the Europeans, and then this week announced that they're going to go ahead and, they went ahead to publish a list of sanctions against the Europeans on Airbus, a long-running dispute over who subsidized whom. Warren, can we link those two things? Is the president now pivoting from going after China to going after the Europeans?
I think they're on separate tracks, and I would not connect them up. The 232 on autos is very much of President Trump's idea. I don't think there's even an interagency process on it. The whole thing is just sitting on his desk for him to sort out. And it's this fascination with the idea that, threatening tariffs on autos because Mexico isn't helping us on immigration, or the EU isn't doing a trade deal, or Japan won't negotiate on beef. He sees the auto tariffs as leverage. The problem, as Mike pointed out, is that just about everyone in the Congress has auto dealerships or auto plants in their district. And so from a congressional or a presidential electoral standpoint, it's a total, loser. On the Boeing-Airbus dispute, that thing has been going on forever. The main thing that you can take away from it is the WTO's rules on trade distorting domestic subsidies are basically ineffectual. It was going it had been started before I was general counsel in 2007 in the George W. Bush administration. It's still going on now, and the end is not anywhere in sight. But this is pretty much part of a WTO dispute that was going on under Bush, went on under Obama, now it's going on under Trump. Who knows? In 4 to 8 years, maybe it'll be going on under President Elizabeth Warren or someone else. But this thing is just grinding its way through a very long and arduous WTO process.
Andrew, do the Europeans recognize that there's a trade issue that is worth negotiating, or are they just responding to the president?
On autos?
On autos, or in theory, the Juncker deal was to talk about industrial production, industrial policy.
It's so hard to wrap your head around the auto issue. I think Warren's right that there's just sort of a strange fascination in some way of the allure that, or the representation somehow that autos, holds, right, for American manufacturing in general. I come from Detroit originally, and I know that there hasn't been a big three in a lot of years now, and there hasn't been an American auto industry in many years. It's a North American auto industry. So there is sort of a strange kind of disregard for, I think, the degree of integration within North American manufacturing in sectors like automotive, aerospace, electronics, and that we are more competitive in the global economy, manufacturing as a region than we are in these sectors, manufacturing as Americans, however you can even try to define that. So this is a bit of a throwback. It doesn't represent really the way manufacturing is conducted today. And the auto tariff and these issues with this obsession that there's a lack of parity. I mean, President Trump talked about it when he first came into office, that there's lack of reciprocity and parity in these tariffs. And so much of that is really just kind of a historical artifact. When we had a relatively low tariff, we were predominant in automaking. It was before you could actually, drive cars on and off large, ships, and that all changed with World War II and being able to move military vehicles around. I mean, there's a whole long history for this. It's really not a contemporary issue, and it just so happens that we, over time, lowered our tariff, and other countries didn't lower their tariffs in the same way. So it's a little bit... Nobody's asking for it. I mean, the auto industry is not asking for it. So there's a question of what are they trying to really accomplish with it? And it really, to me, the worrisome thing is this idea that you can somehow manage trade in specific industries, that you can know, that the administration can know what's the optimal amount of American content that should go into a car. They can't know that. The auto industries know that. They're the ones who employ millions of people in manufacturing and through dealerships and et cetera. So I think that's sort of the troubling sort of germ in all of this, and the idea that it could create kind of a tariff war now between the U.S. and Europe. It's troubling, and I think Europe is just responding the way you would expect, because in the history of imposing tariffs, there's one certain thing that always happens: retaliation. Always, it's fully anticipable. You can anticipate that. So the administration does not need to find that it's in the interest of national security. It's very rare over the history of using that provision of US trade law. It was one case maybe every couple of years. So this is very unprecedented. They've taken this many cases, and it's also the norm that they find that there's no national security issue. So if they were to come to that conclusion, that would actually be the norm in the history of using 232s. They have an out.
Doug, the president likes to talk about the autos in connection with European trade. Folks at USTR and other agencies have suggested that what they really want is to bring the Europeans to the table on agriculture, which agricultural subsidies, I think, have killed more trade deals than any other topic. Is there any chance that we actually could launch some sort of productive round of negotiations with the Europeans that's not just based on 232 on autos?
Well, I think that's going to be a little bit problematic in the sense that, if you have this auto threat hanging over, I don't think the Europeans are going to respond positively to that. I think they will dig their heels in, and they are not going to negotiate with a gun to their head. That said, I think there is an interest in doing something with the U.S. I think there's a recognition, though, that there are a couple of these pockets. It's agriculture and French interests in particular, but the real opportunity and action between the U.S. and Europe is in the regulatory space and standard space, including in agricultural standards. And I think that and that's been recognized for a long time, and that was the premise of the whole TTIP, the earlier incarnation. And I still think there's a desire for that. But I think, and in particular with respect to kind of what's, the kind of the threat that, China presents in terms of its standards becoming the global set of standards that are used. But the problem is that, all these other issues create a political dynamic that I think it makes it hard to kind of move forward. And so, whether it's the auto tariffs, the aluminum, the steel, and, it gets back to kind of that factor that I described earlier, which is, faith in your negotiating partner. And so, the question you have to ask yourself is, do the Europeans have that faith in the United States? And is that going to be sufficient and a basis for moving forward with a comprehensive deal?
Let's talk about the one deal that they did conclude, and that is NAFTA 2, otherwise known as USMCA. Can I first get a show of hands among the four of you? Will it be ratified? Yes. Raise your hand if you think yes.
It could be ratified.
Well, there's a reluctant third vote there, which leaves Mike as the one saying no. So you make your case first.
Okay. So USMCA, I think, is a case of high-stakes politics and low-stakes economics. I mean, in terms of economic effects, likely zero, maybe moderately negative. Obviously, these NAFTA markets are already open to each other. USMCA will make them moderately more restrictive, particularly in the auto sector. It's an IMF paper a couple weeks ago to that effect, and the ITC will probably make a similar finding. But it's certainly high-stakes politics. It's one of President Trump's signature initiatives. He is correcting the worst trade agreement in the history of the world. Lighthizer put it a little differently, but no less dramatically, saying there is no U.S. trade program unless USMCA is approved by Congress. So it's high politics. It's also a little bit of scrambled politics, because for Democrats, there's actually quite a bit to like here. In terms of labor, it's far stronger than NAFTA and even a bit stronger than TPP in terms of the obligations, the right to respect collective bargaining rights and non-discrimination, and et cetera, and includes an annex to the labor chapter with a very prescriptive outline of labor reform legislation that Mexico is now processing through its Congress. It's got currency provisions that are, at least part of them, enforceable. And on the flip side, for the Republicans, there's a lot not to like. A lot of provisions that were included that they were specifically complaining about in advance. Basically eviscerating investment protection for U.S. companies in Mexico, at a time when they probably face more political risk than they have in 3 or 4 decades. The sunset provision, the absence of any government procurement commitments for Canada. So, and yet, despite all of that, the Republicans have more or less lined up in support, while the Democrats are at least keeping their powder dry, but really, I think, just preparing to present a list of requests of things that need to be strengthened about the agreement. For the administration, you know, they're going to have a decision to make. They're going to either engage with the Democrats on that list of demands, or they won't. If they don't, I think it's very unlikely that Speaker Pelosi ever gives them the green light they're looking for to send the agreement to Congress to be considered. But if they do pursue those demands, then I think there's a chance that Republicans could say, well, look, if you're going to accommodate those concerns, we've got a long list as well. And so the longer this process goes into this year, sort of the less likely it is to actually get up and across the House and Senate floors. And so that's why, at the end of the day, I have to place a bet. I don't think it gets through. You know, the one wild card is, could President Trump himself short-circuit this discussion by saying, look, no, it's take it or leave it. You vote on USMCA, or I'm taking the United States out of this agreement. And that threat worked very well last year with Canada and Mexico. It worked well and continues to work well with Republicans. It doesn't work very well with Democrats. If President Trump were to pursue that course, don't look for Nancy Pelosi to save him. Don't look for her to be cowed into saying, okay, never mind about the list of demands that we presented, we'll go ahead and send up the agreement and we'll vote for it. So I think that back and forth will be very challenging on the substance and on the politics, and I think that there will be enough delay that it takes us deeply into the campaign season, the presidential campaign season, that is, and makes a vote unlikely.
Doug, you were the first one to raise your hand on the optimist side.
Halfway.
You think that they can get it through, and is it going to be based on the idea of take it or leave it, we withdraw from NAFTA if you don't pass the USMCA?
Well, so I agree with a lot of what Mike said, but I think there were a couple pivot points where maybe I think I have maybe a slightly different view. I think the administration will negotiate with the Democrats. I mean, every single administration has had to do that. You know, that's just a political reality. You know, now the question is, you know, will that be accompanied by a Republican desire to Christmas tree the agreement? I don't think so. And so I think, you know, Speaker Pelosi does have, it is going to be difficult. She has to get some significant portion of her caucus. It can't just be 20 or 30 members. So there are going to have to be changes to make that work. And I think that, you know, I think the U.S. business community really wants a deal. I think they do have enough of a voice in both parties. And so maybe I'm slightly just thinking the better angels might prevail here. But to be very clear, it is going to be hard. It is not going to be an easy thing. And, you know, Mike mentioned the wild card. You know, if the president does put down an ultimatum, I don't think that's going to play well either.
Andrea, even Republicans have said they're not going to vote for the deal unless the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico are removed. Why haven't they been, and are they going to be?
I think the administration would have served itself very well by removing those tariffs months ago. But they have it in their mind that steel, I mean, I think coming into the administration, steel was going to be protected in some way. And we've always known, we've done this before, they're not the first administration to do this. Almost every administration in the last few years has protected steel at some point or another for some period of time. And it doesn't usually help the industry over the long run, right? It raises prices for a period of time. There's a few hundred people who are reemployed, but for every steel worker, there are 16 people in steel-using industries. We know what the costs are of this, and we know that it must be temporary. And I think it is high time that they remove them. I think this administration seems to be in favor of negotiating quotas to replace them. Unfortunately, sort of the history of doing that means that other countries move into very high value production in steel and aluminum. They get very good at that. They fill the quota. They get very good at other forms of production. I mean, in the long run, we're kind of hurt by it. And I do think the administration should just sort of pull the Band-Aid off at this point for the industry. They've done enough for a period of time, and I think they're going to have to do it to get the USMCA through, because both Republicans, Republicans and Democrats want to see that happen at this point. It's kind of rare that everybody is in agreement. And that's really, I mean, the retaliatory tariffs against agriculture and other products from Canada and Mexico, and they're busy making their list, their carousel. They're gonna target agriculture for sure, because they know agriculture at this point has suffered enough to put pressure on the administration, and they benefit so much from trade with Canada and Mexico that they're going to put pressure to remove those tariffs and get USMCA through. So I think the administration really needs to do it. Need to do it soon.
Warren, a question from the audience here. Game theory. Suppose the president does say, ratify USMCA, or I'll pull us out of NAFTA. Take it or leave it. Can Nancy Pelosi say, leave it? What happens to North American trade if the Democrats won't cave to the president?
Well, Pelosi is really the key to all of this, and she really hasn't shown her cards yet. I mean, the Democratic caucus is still working through to come up with some sort of a list of concerns. There was a letter yesterday from House Ways and Means Chairman Neal, who's, I think, made it clear he's at least is prepared to deal on USMCA, but it was sort of a placeholder letter. But Pelosi really calls the shots on this thing. Lighthizer is a pro. He worked on the Hill for 7 years for Senator Dole. So he knows Capitol Hill well, and he's been up there doing a lot of meetings, even in the midst of all of this China stuff, with various parts of the Democratic caucus. And I think he's made it pretty clear that he's prepared to try and work with the Democrats on some of their concerns. His challenge is if he's going to, make changes or fix the agreement to try and take care of Democratic problems. One, he's got a time problem, because if it leads to reopening the agreement and then you have to re-notify it under the Trade Promotion Authority procedures, you're well into 2020, and it seems very unlikely that there could be a vote on this in the middle of an election year. His other problem is that some of the changes that the Democrats are going to want are going to cost Republican votes. And that's always the fine line that an administration has to walk in trying to negotiate, get the votes to win this thing, which typically requires some Democrats, but is overwhelmingly on past trade votes over the last 20 years, Republicans. I worked in the George W. Bush administration, so I'm somewhat paranoid about Pelosi after what happened on Colombia, Korea, Panama, and whatnot. I think her best option here would be if there's no vote. So if Donald Trump starts the withdrawal process, and this is somewhat different from Brexit, where at the end of the 6 months, you're automatically out unless you get an extension. Under NAFTA, he would have to take a further step of actually pulling out, which is going to have major consequences for a lot of American industries, particularly autos, and also for agriculture, since Canada and Mexico are our first and third largest agricultural export markets. So, but the other thing for Pelosi is at that point, she's off the hook. We were prepared to work with you, but the president took this precipitous step and just pulled out. And basically it's all Donald Trump's fault. So I think we've got a high-stakes game of poker that's going on, and it's going to go on for a while. It really hasn't ripened up yet because, well, it ripens up next week because the ITC's report comes out. It's the first sort of neutral assessment of this thing. And the other thing is the Mexican Congress seems on track to pass the labor reform bill. And the Democrats have made it clear, rightfully so, that that's a prerequisite for a serious dialogue over this thing.
A couple more audience questions I want to get through while we still have a few minutes here. So, Mike, can I ask you? We have made a big deal, we being the U.S., of putting in labor and environmental standards into treaties like the USMCA. Suppose China were to turn around and say, the United States pulled out of Paris, we're not the good actor on the environment anymore. We're going to insist that in whatever deal we make with you, that you live up to certain environmental standards. Could that happen? Could the administration agree to something?
No, I mean, certainly not this administration, but it is interesting because in US FTA practice, in our environment chapters, we do say that as a matter of this trade agreement, you agree to adopt and maintain in your domestic laws provisions that effectively implement the international environmental agreements that you're a party to. Now, this administration didn't like that very much, and they figured out a different way to achieve the same result in USMCA by instead referring specifically to maritime pollution and ozone depletion and air quality. But we have that in our FTA policy now. Would we ever sign up to something that obligated us to meet Paris Agreement commitments? No, of course not. But it is already part of US FTA practice, and a different administration absolutely could agree to do that in the future.
Doug, let me ask you, and this may be the last question, so you have about 2 minutes left. Whether you like the president's strategies or not, he could, in theory, by the end of his first term, have an agreement with Canada and Mexico, have an agreement, he made an agreement with South Korea to the extent that it changes a whole lot, have an agreement with China, and possibly an agreement with Europe, possibly even an agreement with Japan. They're going to start talking next week. Would there have been another strategy that could produce as much in as short a period of time in the world of trade?
Well, yes, I think there was the TPP that would have covered a lot of those bases. A huge percentage of trade could have extended the TTIP. But that's sort of like what could have, should have, maybe. I think if the president accomplishes those things, we should, and they're good agreements, we should applaud that. And we have taken, there's been some critical comments that have been voiced about some of his approach, and I mean I think that's fair. But I think it gets back to a comment that was made about uncertainty. I think for the business community, uncertainty is a big problem. Trade policy historically has been designed to minimize that uncertainty around what is inherently a risky proposition, trading across borders, investing across borders. And if trade policy, despite the twists and turns, and the president can get us to a point where he's brought forward a higher degree of certainty, and has meaningfully addressed the problems with China, that should be applauded. And and I think we should hopefully over the course of the next 2 years make some progress on that.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. We'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today on international trade. Thank you.
Thank you.